people will monitor it. Someone will be monitoring it at like 24 hours a day, and they'll record the audio that they hear on it, because there have been multiple instances where you can hear people talking in the background.
That's
the entire buzzer is turned off, and there's just a human that speaks, but they're not necessarily giving out those numbers, those messages like we talked about before. So we don't know what's going on. It has led people to the extreme cases to hypothesize that it is like a dead man switch.
It has long been speculated that there are radio stations all over the planet that operate in a simple and foolproof way for government agencies communicating with spies working undercover. Tonight, we're going to discover the world of espionage that uses the air around us to communicate with embedded agents that could be your next-door neighbor. Tonight, we talk about number stations. That and more coming right up on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, one, zero, and liftoff.
When you think of internet sensations like Jeffree Star, Good Mythical Morning, PewDiePie, and Logan Paul, you don't think of my guest, who has been a licensed amateur since 2007 with a call sign KI6NAZ. But you should be thinking about him because you could be learning something amazing for free. And in 2015, Josh began making ham radio related videos on YouTube to help amateur radio and make that accessible to everyone. And tonight, we're going to talk about amateur radio, more than just amateur radio, and the mysterious world out there known as the number station. Josh, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm very excited to talk about some ham radio and number stations. Those are always fun.
Yeah, it's amazing. But you have a YouTube channel. You have like 1 million subscribers, 500 million views. How does that happen? How long you been doing it? I mean, since 2015?
I started my YouTube channel in 2006, 2007, about the same time I got licensed as an amateur
You've been going a long
operator.
time. Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah, but back then, I was just kind of following whatever hobby I was in. All kinds of just mishmash videos all over the place, which I had fun making. But in 2015, I decided, the thing I've been doing the most, and it's consistently been in my life, is amateur radio. And I went out and I did a series of live streams on getting people their technician license, getting them, the first step on the way to enjoying the amateur radio hobby. And I got a really good response from everybody on it. So I said, well, I'll do this weekly. So I was doing a weekly live stream and having a lot of fun with that. And it just started taking off from there. So now I do a weekly live stream every Saturday, 5 p.m. and a standalone video. And the standalone videos are kind of like reviews or some kind of specific condensed topic that I want to cover. And that usually is anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes or so. So that's what I've been doing for, now the last 2 years consistently. But before that, it kind of really started in 2015.
So how many videos do you think you have up there right now? It's a lot.
Well, I have a lot of videos that are privatized that you can't see anymore. I have them hidden. But as of right now, I think I'm close to 1,000 videos.
Wow.
And I'm well over, I actually don't know how many million views I have, but we just got around to 85,000 subscribers for amateur radio. I think that's pretty good.
It's huge. I think it's really huge. I mean, that's, you know, and because amateur radio guys, they're on the radio, you know, they should be. They should.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It seems like it's a changing of the guard in a lot of ways. I mean,
right.
That's kind of a weird thing to say, but there's a younger generation of people. The demographics on YouTube kind of tilts younger, and those individuals seem to gravitate more towards new media than the traditional ways you might have found out about amateur radio in the past.
Yeah. And just so people know, describe in the best way you can what amateur radio is and who's out there doing it and how you got into it.
Okay, man, how much time we have? So amateur radio
we
in
have
a
all
nutshell.
Night, so.
Okay, good. Amateur radio in a nutshell is self-supported communication. And what I mean by that specifically is we don't depend on the internet. We don't depend on the network, you know, your AT&Ts or whatever in the world. We put up a radio and an antenna and we can communicate. And the way that the RF spectrum is kind of out there, we can use different bands of operation and get different types of communication. So if you think about those little handy talkies that you may have seen someone using out in the field or wherever, amateur radio operators can access higher powered versions of those handy talkies, and we can do what we call line of sight communication, because those handy talkies generally operate on VHF and UHF frequency spaces. So that's great for local kind of communication. But what we also have access to is the HF bands. And the HF bands give us the ability to go to lower frequencies, bigger antennas, a little bit more powerful radios. And with the HF radios, we can bounce our signals off of the ionosphere. So we're able to make super long distance contact from one party to another party, one-to-one, or anybody that wants to listen on those frequencies. And we can do a myriad of things. We can just talk, which is what, primarily most people do, is they get on there and they talk. But we have all these really cool digital modes now that allow us to send information. So we can send files, we can have a chat, we can send simple short messages back and forth. And they're great because since they are digital, we can use lower power, or we can go way down into the noise because the computer is capable of kind of picking out those audio signals better than the human ear is. So there's that, and there's still traditional Morse code kicking around. There are lots of good reasons why you'd want to use Morse code over voice in certain situations, and people still use it. It's still active, and it's a lot of fun.
And I know back in the day, back in the late 70s, early 80s, when my neighbor or two were getting into this, and I had one neighbor who was really into it. The guys who were just starting out, in my memory, I think they were doing Morse code, and then they got a different license and were using a mic and a transceiver, right? Is that how that used to work? Because it's different now, right? That I don't think I'm old enough to remember kind of back how it used to be. I know back in the day, people used to have to go to the FCC branch offices to test, and you had to get tested on Morse code. And all that started to change in the mid 90s, and then we kind of phased out the Morse code requirement in the 2000s, the early 2000s. So what that means is you're not tested on Morse code anymore. So a brand new amateur radio, someone interested in amateur radio, can go pursue their technician license, and that will give them access to all the UHF bands that I mentioned earlier, so those line of sight communications, and it'll give you some access on 10 meters. And 10 meters is what we call a daytime band. It's in the HF space, but it's on the higher frequency side of HF, so it's going to be a little bit better during the daytime. That's kind of when it's most active. If somebody was really interested in getting into this, and maybe like me, somebody who has a podcast, is it possible to actually have a radio station that you broadcast daily on where you would do something with like a podcast, and even with commercials? Does that happen?
Oh yeah, absolutely. My live stream, I often will have my radio running. And what's great about radios today, the one that I primarily use, it's just one USB cable that connects the radio to the computer. And there are software that will display the actual radio controls on your computer. So people watching me on the live stream can not only hear the audio, which is coming over USB, but they can also see the controls and what I'm doing, what frequency I'm operating on, a whole thing. So yeah, there's quite a lot you can do today with computers that have been kind of assimilated into amateur radio, the hobby we have.
So literally in a simultaneous event, you can be online and you can do your show via YouTube while you're doing it over one of your radios. And so what band or what bandwidth or how do you describe that, your radio station, how that goes out? Is it AM? Is it FM?
Oh, okay. Great question. So let me go back one step. I don't transmit my show over amateur radio.
Okay.
It's more or less a part of the show. So if somebody wanted to make a contact or whatever, we could do that during the show. But the stream, if you will, and then the later podcast, that goes to YouTube. You can't really, it is amateur radio, not professional radio. So we don't really broadcast like you would consider a broadcast AM or FM station. So with that regard, my station at home, my radio that I use is an ICOM IC7300 is my most primary radio. And that's considered an entry-level radio. It is what they call a SDR or software-defined radio. So there is a lot of more technical smarts in it than most of the older type radios that were, in the 70s and in the early 90s. Things have kind of gone a little bit more technical and we're able to leverage that capability. The modes that I generally participate on are single sideband, which single sideband is really just AM without the center carrier tone and one of the sidebands cut off. So if you know what AM looks like, it has a big center carrier, and sometimes you can hear it when you're tuning a traditional AM radio. It's got like a hum spot. You can hear it as you're getting closer to it. There's a lot of hum. And then bam, you're in the middle of it. And it's almost kind of like everything quiets down. Our two side lobes, the information, the human is kind of embedded into those side lobes. And that's what's sent out over the air, over the RF. The advantage to single sideband over AM is that we're able to have a decent audio quality without having to use the extra power needed to run the carrier, the center frequency, and the second side lobe that you'd be removing.
So you mentioned SDR, software-defined radio, which is interesting to me because I just had looked into that. And that's a way for me, if I wanted to, and there's a couple of different ways, but I can buy a dongle and you can get it on Amazon for less than $30, and you can hook that up and throw some wire out your window and listen to amateur radio.
Yeah, that's right. There are a couple of caveats with the really, really cheap dongles. The really cheap dongles are great because they've got a really good price point, but they don't do HF radio that well. Right. They seem to do a lot better on the VHF, UHF space, which is fine because if you're in an area like I am here in Southern California, VHF, UHF is extremely popular. So there's lots of life. There's lots of fun stuff to listen to. Not to mention, all these bands are it's all VHF, UHF, just to talk about that specifically. But the amateur space is separate from the police radios and the public works radios and all this other stuff. But when you have an SDR receiver, you see all the spaces. So you could be listening to, your public works. You could be listening to amateur radio operators. You could be listening to police officers, assuming that they're not encrypted radios like a lot of them are going these days. But with those SDRs, you can you get a really cool visual way to learn and understand how radio works out there. So it's super cool. I love those little dongles.
And you don't even have to go with the dongle. You can go to websdr.com or .org rather. And there's a lot of opportunity to listen to radio there. And it's basically, you're on a website that acts just like a radio, and you can tune to different stations and experiment there. Yeah.
They're great. Make sure when you hop on one of those, where it's geographically located, because that's where it's going to be picking up the signals. And they'll often tell you what kind of antenna they're using, what bands of operation. So to go back a little bit, we mentioned the 10-meter band being a daytime band. Well, in addition to being a daytime band, everybody on Earth, we are experiencing a solar minimum right now. The sun is on an 11-year minimum maximum cycle. It happens every 11 years. And we're at the low point of the cycle, which means that RF signals don't transfer as far as they would in the maximum. So during minimum, where we are today, we try and use the lower frequency band. So we try to use 80 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters, a little bit more. And those bands are good for night owls like myself because they're more of nighttime bands.
You had talked earlier about like you see some people in the field with handheld radios, and I wanted to make it known how easy, and it's not, I shouldn't say how easy it is to get into this because there's some studying involved and there's some licensing, but it's not going to break the bank. And, there's a company, and I'm sure you know this company, and it's very controversial at times for this handheld, but there's this Bofang radio, and went on to eBay and got one shipped to me for $7.50. And had to stay up till 1 a.m. to get that auction, but you can do that. And these I think these radios mirror some more expensive versions that come out of Japan and different places, but nonetheless, I mean, this is a piece of equipment that you can use, and if you wanted to get your license, you could be on the air.
Yeah, definitely. If you go on YouTube and you search for Baofeng, you're probably going to see my face, because some of my most popular videos are those Baofeng programming videos I made back when I was first creating these amateur radio videos. And what I remind people is that when I got started in 2007, the kind of cheapest radio I bought or could get my hands on was a Yaesu FT60R. And that's still in production, and it's still a good radio. It's still quite a good radio. It's come down in price, but it's a great, fine radio to get started. The Baofengs, if you just went on Amazon, they're like $23 to get one, and they basically do the same function as the Yaesu FT60. Now, the FT60 is more robust. It has better filtering, and it has features that the Baofeng does not. However, for most people to get started in radio, I feel the Baofeng is a great kind of gateway drug to it, because you'll know pretty quickly if this is something that interests you or not. The only caveat I always remind people with Baofeng radios, with VHF, UHF in general, amateur radio is a much bigger world than just that. So do make sure you kind of explore the area before saying, oh no, this isn't for me. There's nobody to talk to out here. I don't hear anybody. For example, I was just talking to somebody that was building themselves a directional beam antenna out of a tape measure that they picked up at Harbor Freight. And they can connect it to their Baofeng, and they work the low Earth orbit amateur radio satellite.
Wow.
Just with the Baofeng.
Wow.
It's fantastic.
I like the tape measure thing. I mean, that's a good idea, because basically you're there with a coiled up 25 foot or 35 foot piece of metal, and
no, basically it's it looks like a television antenna, but It's just 3 elements, and they're really short because 2 meters is not it doesn't require a lot of material. So, it's just a little hand wavy antenna that you build on a PVC pipe, and you could be tracking radio amateur satellites that are basically a repeater. So someone on the ground is hitting the satellite is changing the band of operation and downlinking it. And because the satellite's so high, you get a huge propagation space. So it can transmit the RF to a large portion of the ground that it, received the signal from. So, there's people that go out there and they try and make as many contacts as possible on these low Earth orbit passes, because the satellite's only in view for, best cases like 9 minutes or so. And it's really flying, right? These low Earth orbiting satellites are, I think, 10,000 to 14,000 miles per hour in orbit as they fly overhead, which is, you'd start boggling the mind. But it's really fun because you're building it on your own, right? You can hear these people, you can talk with them. And then what's really cool is that same antenna you use to potentially pick up satellites, you can use for radio direction finding, which, is something you've probably heard. How did they track this person down? Well, they use radio direction finding, radio triangulation. And you did it with a antenna you built with some spare PVC pipes and a tape measure you got from Harbor Freight for $10.
That's really cool. And I have that Bofang. I'm going to give that away to one of our listeners, and hopefully they can find some enjoyment, because here's the thing about that radio. Not only, was it $7.50, but I don't even know how they could have shipped it to California to me for $7.50. So really there's, you're talking about a net profit of a couple dollars on a piece of hardware that it's the real deal. And so we're going to give that away. Yeah. And so you're online listening to radio. You might have your dongle hooked up to your computer. You might have your own shack where you have all your ham radio equipment. Other than talking to people around the world and communicating with people, what are people listening to? What do you like to listen to when you're not communicating back and forth with someone?
I like to listen to broadcast stations. I'll have them running in the background. I really like to see if I can find and pull out foreign shortwave stations. They're dwindling, but there are still, interesting shortwave stations that are out there that you can listen to. And there's, all kinds of really interesting ways to track them online. You can, there's different guides that you can look at, and it'll tell you, hey, at about right now, these couple of stations are transmitting, and I'll pull out my radio and see if I can hear them. And that gives me, I like it for the technical challenge of trying to put up an antenna that can pick up these far off stations. So for me, it's always kind of like, tweaking my station, making it as effective as I can to have like the most fun with it. I really like shortwave stations. Broadcast stations are fine as well. There's also beacon stations, which are a little bit more esoteric for amateur radio, but it basically will give you kind of a geographic picture of how far away the transmitting station is. And you go, okay, I'm picking up that station on this frequency at this time. That's a good piece of information to have.
And if people don't realize, this is hobby that's gone back a long ways. And not only that, it's something that, in the practical application, people used to communicate with radio, and even around 1910 and later, through World War II, it was a big deal. I mean, radio was a big deal, and TV didn't exist, and that's the way people communicated. But there were also other things happening there. Different countries were using during our Cold War and previous to that in other wars. People were using, their radio stations, which were very, very technical and huge. I mean, they were pumping out these broadcasts that went around the world theoretically, and they were in the hundreds and thousands. So when I was a kid, and I wanted to tell you about this because you could probably give me some insight. When I was a kid, everybody had a radio that, one of these multi-band radios. It was this big hulking unit, which was probably like 18 inches wide, maybe even 24 inches wide, depending on, how much money you put into it. But, they're a foot tall, and on the back, they usually had a map that flopped open, and it was a world map. The thing, the display on it was really large, and it had multi-bands. It did just about anything, if you're receiving radio, a radio could do back then. And what was that? I mean, describe what a multi-band radio was and what people were doing with that.
Yeah, so that was likely a general coverage receiver. And, again, I'm not the best radio historian, but as you mentioned, when there, World War II and actually much more recent than that, there was still a major primary use case for radio. and people were still using it to get these large broadcasts out for not just government information, but for just commercial information, right? They're like commercial radio shows. We're obviously all familiar with AM, FM, and satellite radio has shows like that too. But back then, they used shortwave, and to specify, and of course there was still AM, but shortwave is the frequency space, kind of what we were already hinting at with amateur radio, starting at around 10 meters and going all the way down to the very, very low frequencies, 160 meters and lower. And I know I'm counting up. I'm going from 10 meters to 160, and I'm saying it's less frequency. The reason for that is the actual RF wave in a physical term, if you were to represent it physically, would be 160 meters from peak to valley, right? If you're thinking about an audio or radio wave. So those general coverage receivers would have many bands of operation because of what I mentioned a little bit earlier, the day and night cycle. The high frequency bands are good in the daytime, and the lower frequencies are better at nighttime. So those general coverage receivers, you would jump down in bands as the day turned into night, and then as it got further into night, you would go further down until the sun comes back up, and then you'd start working your way back up. And there were shows or radio stations that would transmit on same show. They would transmit at different times of day on different bands so that you could catch them if you didn't have a radio that had all the bands, or more likely, you didn't have a perfect antenna for all bands. You had a couple of bands that you worked pretty well as a receiver, and you could pick up those far off stations with that. And remember, this is also, I think you hinted at it, this is a large propaganda type thing too. We used radio as an effective propaganda during the wars. We would actually have, radio stations, the Voice of America, right? Which is a museum you can go check out today. And they would have their station set up to basically beam their RF into particular countries to get their information out there. Their, propaganda would be the word to use, but, it's trying to show the country of origin for the channel as, the lighter side of it. And, China still has radio shortwave. Radio Havana is the Cuban shortwave station, and they transmit daily, and you can pick them up all the time. At least I can from California. I can get Radio Havana pretty easy.
So early on, let's just talk about World War II and starting there. But when they would broadcast propaganda like that, and they had a radio station that did that, and maybe it was let's say it was in Cuba, let's say it was in the UK. What kind of power are they transmitting at, and what kind of technical and hardware did you need to put out that type of a signal, back then?
So they were using, AM stations. A lot of them are still using AM. And what I mean specifically is, I know I mentioned shortwave and then I mentioned AM. Shortwave is the frequency space. AM is the mode of operation. So that's the amplitude modulated. That's the one with the carrier and the side lobe. They still used AM modulation on the shortwave bands, but you would need many, many thousands of kilowatts to do some of the work that they're doing, and very specific antennas to make the RF propagate over a large space. That's where those, big, tall vertical towers, as you may have seen before. And the interesting thing about those big vertical towers, that is the antenna. The tower is all part of the antenna system. It is radiating that RF, particularly on those big AM stations. And like I said, those are still in use today. Antenna technology changes, but they're putting out buku power. They're putting many more kilowatts than we're allowed to as radio amateurs. We top out at 1.5 thousand watts of output for amateur radio operators. So big transmitting broadcasting stations, way more than that.
Any idea historically what has been one of the longest on-air radio stations of that type?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to the longest running shortwave station.
But there's been other kind of types of stations that have been operating for years and years and years. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about number station and describe what a number station is, because, not only were they theoretically used in espionage, but there's other types of stations that have been called number stations that kind of fall into that unknown genre that is really quite mysterious and very, very interesting for sure.
Yeah. So the kind of the easiest way to explain it, if you wanted to get your message out to a large number of people, you'd use an AM station, and you have microphones, and you talk into them, and you use a standard language, and everybody would understand your message. If you didn't want people to understand your message, and you wanted to possibly just get it to one specific person, you might have used a number station. And remember, this is prior to telephones, long distance telephones, that kind of thing. So you would use radio. And so this would be a covert espionage station of some type in some country that would be transmitting into the country where a spy would have been. And they would transmit at very specific times of day, preordained times on specific frequencies. And there's usually some kind of audio tone. And then it would be followed by either a human, more often than not a female voice, saying a string of numbers. And the receiving station, which would be in the, under deep cover as a spy behind enemy lines, would use a radio. And again, these are radios that are covert in their nature. If you ever Google spy radios or spy number station radios, you'll see some pretty interesting radios that come up. And they would receive these numbers and write them down, and then later convert them into whatever the message is. So this is going beyond, drink your Ovaltine, the little
that's a good one,
Annie.
though. Yeah, that's one I always think of.
Yeah. But if you remember the button or the pin that little Orphan Annie's decoder had, they would set it, and it would be a number string to a character of some kind. And then you would turn that. They tell you, okay, the number of the day is A12. And so you'd set your A to 12, and then they'd give you a random string of numbers. And all you'd have to do is match the number up to the character, and there's your message. Now, number stations are way more complicated than that. Well, kind of more complicated than that. But that's it in a nutshell. Is you just have one Annie Oakley decoder ring that would be with the spy, and the home espionage transmitting station would be keyed up with that spy to transmit a ciphered text message, which would then be decoded by the spy.
And the recipient of the message would have a one-time pad that they would use.
Yes.
And that one interesting thing about this technique, and it's been used a long time, is that it can't be cracked. And
that's right.
And can't be hacked or cracked, or it's foolproof. And people have asked, and I was talking about it a couple of times in the last couple of weeks about this one-time pad, and why didn't they use like an encrypted software or with the internet?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. This is
it didn't exist.
Right. But even now, this is one technique that can be cracked. So it's an interesting thing that's being used. And I want to play a sample. And I know you've heard this, and a lot of people have heard this. It's called the Lincolnshire Poacher, and it was a shortwave number station that transmitted from Cyprus, and it started in the mid-'70s and ran about to June 2008, and I'll play a sample of that right now. So that song is called The Lincolnshire Poacher. And the radio station was believed to be operated by British intelligence and from the island of Cyprus. And interestingly enough, it has that electronically synthesized English woman, the female voice, and reading those digits, and she kind of her voice kind of goes up and higher at the end, and it's just really, really unusual. I mean, I say this one is unusual, but they are all incredibly unusual, don't you think?
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's
I love the fact that you can just, turn the radio on. Now, of course, these are not in amateur frequencies. The frequencies that they would transmit this on are outside those spaces. But with a general coverage receiver, you could pull these up, and they're still in use today. I mean, you said that the Lincolnshire Poacher ended in 2007? Was that what you said?
2008, it says, yeah.
2008. That's crazy to a certain degree, because we have all this technology now. So why did they keep doing it, right? And we don't know, because we don't know who the recipients were of the message. We can infer some things, right? Because the lady has kind of a British accent, and you said it was likely maintained by the British. But the audio on it, to me, is almost haunting. It's like a deranged ice cream man truck's audio that starts up in the beginning of that thing. And I always get kind of goosebumps when I hear it, particularly, and put yourself, you're listening to this over some, newfangled device like an iPhone or Android phone, and you're on, or maybe your computer. It's very simple. You just type in a URL or a keyword, and hey, here's this podcast I'm listening to right now. But back then you kind of had to know, or you're tuning around with your hand. It's late at night. You're rolling the VFO. That's the big dial that changes the frequency. And you stumble upon one of these. How eerie would that be? Right? I find the whole thing fascinating.
Here's the interesting thing to me. The part that I love the most is the fact that, so now I can go to a website and I can basically put in the frequency, just type it in with my keyboard. It'll take me there. And there's lots of stations like this that still exist, and you can catch them from time to time.
Yep.
And there's usually I don't know what you'd call this, but a lot of those stations, even when they're not broadcasting, they have some sort of background thing that's like on all the time. And it's always
like a carrier or just some kind of like tone.
It's like to keep it open, to keep that station open. So, when I was a kid, and things have changed a lot, but when I was a kid, again, we had this multi-band radio, and we would go up in the neighbor's house because it was on the hill and it was higher than everybody else. And we'd be up in the attic, and it'd be sweltering hot in there, even at 10 o'clock at night. We'd sleep up there with this radio, and just go back and forth across the dial. And back then, it was, you could hardly even move the dial without getting a different station. So back then, in the like 1979, there was thousands of stations all over the world, and at nighttime you could pick them up, and there were these type of stations that were creepy. And there's other creepy stuff on there that it's a broadcast. Nobody knows where it is, where it comes from, or why.
Mm-hmm. I find, so, I mean, when you were younger and you were using the radio to kind of explore, right? You're filled with a kind of mystery about it, even if it wasn't a number station you found, but you stumbled onto something else. We've simplified so many things with the internet and with our access to amazing technology that we lose some of that wonder of just sitting down in front of something like a radio and just, ever so slightly turning this knob until you can hear something, right? Or you get something back and you're like, I don't really know what that is. There's a scene in the movie Contact where the main character is a young girl, and she's kind of playing around with an amateur radio, and she's just listening, right? And that's kind of what you can still do all that. That's still out there with amateur radio. But when you stumble on one of these number stations, it's like, wow, okay, that's pretty wild. You mentioned a website. I'll throw one out there really quick. It's priom.org or priom.org, YOM.org. They run a actual radio schedule for number stations. And what makes this so cool is that when you're on the schedule, you see the next one that's upcoming, you click on it, and they'll have a link, in most cases, to a web SDR that is kind of proven to be able to receive the station. And it'll be pre-tuned. You just hit, turn the volume up on it, and you can be listening on the radio when the number station goes live via the power of the internet, but you're still doing it at the end. That last 100 feet or whatever, the work there is done via radio, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think one of the other things too that I remember, and even now you can listen, and there's a lot of open space on there, but there's things that you can hear, and it may not be a radio station, it may not be a broadcast, it's something. And there's patterns. I mean, there's sounds and patterns, and these sounds make different patterns. And, it's who knows where they come from, what they are. I mean, there's just thousands of things like that you can stumble upon. And I think it's a really great hobby for people to have. And I think one of the things that I really, really noticed, especially getting online to Facebook and chatting with guys who are in amateur radio, they're extremely helpful. I mean, I've never been part of a more helpful group of people who are just like, you post something on Facebook and you're going to get 50 responses.
Mm-hmm. It's generally a very knowledge-focused hobby. Everybody is in it to really kind of grow and understand how radio works. Of course, there's some bad eggs every once in a while, and that's with any hobby, I feel. But amateur radio is a hobby that is really knowledge focused, because you have to, right? Going back to what you said, it's cheap to get started. It truly is. But as you start getting into it a little bit more, just like any hobby, it starts getting more expensive. And when it gets more expensive, because these are, in a certain way of looking at it, these are scientific devices of high sensitivity that you want to spend some time really researching it, figure out what's right for you. And there's a world of people that are more than happy to tell your opinions on why this radio is good, this one's not so good. So it's a really cool community because there's so many smart people. And it's fun because it's an active community now more than ever. The sitting in your garage or in your ham shack of amateur radio is still a thing. I still do that. But because radios have gotten so much smaller, and we now have kind of connection to our phones with radios, we use them outdoors now. We go to parks. I climb mountains and set up my radio station because getting out in those locations gets the noise level down, the ambient noise level. Because what's changed is, as you said, there's things out there on the frequencies. You can pick them up and hear them. Well, we're doing a lot of that to ourselves with our Wi-Fi devices, our new highly efficient appliances. They use switching power supplies. Switching power supplies will put out RF if it's not appropriately shielded. And so we'll often use any kind of excuse to go outdoors with radio because it's a super quiet environment. There's no technology around us, and we can get really, really clear audio, and we can, make our contacts and all that fun stuff. So yeah, it's a great, I keep saying it's a great time to be in amateur radio. We're co-opting and bringing in all the new technologies to use with our radios, but we're still doing it on our own. It's still our radio talking to this other radio that's far and away from us without the help of anybody else, which is very, it gives me a personal responsibility type of thing, preparedness type of feeling.
Absolutely. I want to play another one of these. This one is called, this is another station that you hear with amateur radio. It's called Russian Man, or we call it Russian Man.
008 0 1 0 0 8 0 4 6 5 4 3 4 6 5 4 3 2 5 7 2 5 7.
Another station that had been around for decades, and not a lot of explanation on what that is or why it is, but it's one of those things that people that are really into the hobby, they've gotten together and they've actually tried to locate these different stations and try to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, going back to what I said about the radio direction finding, right? If you built an antenna that can receive the station, and it's a directional antenna, a beam antenna, we call it, you can triangulate it. And I believe that's how they actually ended up finding one of the number stations, which we might talk about a little bit later, at least its first location that it transmitted from, but it moved. And it's interesting, right? Because if you're transmitting, someone can pick it up. And there are amateurs in particular, we love doing it because it's like a mystery. Who is this? We got to figure this out. And so there's all kinds of easy ways to find these stations that are out there if you're local enough that you can pick them up within close range.
I mean, your mind really begins to wander when you think about, you could listen to these things 20 years ago if you're a kid, and it's the same now. And they're still probably using mostly the same technology, and it hasn't changed that much. And it's just, I just watched part of a movie, and that was on Netflix, and I can't remember, I think it's called Number Station. And it's it's a spy movie, and it's more high tech. It starts out where
John Cusack.
Cusack's
right?
in that, and it starts out where they're at this really, really high tech number station, but as it turns out, a lot of these have been described. There's some old equipment that they use to broadcast, in addition to even a turntable. Like there's one that I don't remember the actual number station, and I didn't get a sample of it, but you could actually hear that this was an album that they printed or that they pressed. And, even though that the number sequence would change, they're actually pressing this into an album and playing this old record, back in the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s. And each one of these, records were cut specifically for whatever duty this was that nobody knows.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of the big transmitting stations, even the, terrestrial AM stations that we have today, they all still use, tubes and stuff like that for final transmitters. So a lot of that technology is still into play. And with these number stations, if it works, why fix it, right? It's not broken. So keep going.
All right. So this one's a little bit obnoxious. It's kind of your nightmare alarm in the morning, but this one's been called UVB 76, and I'll turn it way down. What do you know about that one?
Yeah. Well, so that was the one I was actually referring to, that they did direction finding, and they found the original location for that. And that's known as the Russian buzzer.
Right.
Now, I can't tell I don't know when that file was recorded, but having listened to it, I believe that recording was from its first location. It's moved now, and its current location, it doesn't sound the same. It's got the same brant, brant, brant type of thing, but it's almost got like a lower tone quality to it. So that was pretty interesting that's the copy of it that you have. Maybe I'm wrong, but that sounds like an older transmission copy. So what that is, well, I can't say what it is because no one knows. But that started during the Cold War.
Right.
And it's gone like that pretty much 24/7. And no one knows why, and it just keeps turning out that noise. And so you might be thinking, somebody just bumped into it's a malfunctioning transmitter. And many people have made that argument. But the interesting thing about it is there have been, and let me preface this by saying, if you have a radio station that people don't understand, people will monitor it. Someone will be monitoring it at like 24 hours a day, and they'll record the audio that they hear on it. Because there have been multiple instances where you can hear people talking in the background,
Right.
or
That's
the
unbelievable.
entire buzzer is turned off and there's just a human that speaks.
Right.
But they're not necessarily giving out those cipher text messages like we've talked about before. So we don't know what's going on. It has led people to the extreme cases to hypothesize that it is like a dead man switch.
Right.
That if this ever turns off, height of the Cold War, where the tensions are high. If this ever turns off, will it start Armageddon? But we don't know.
Right.
Very interesting. That one is very ominous.
Yeah, it is. And so what you had referred to, they call it a dead hand station, where it's possible that, this thing emits this tone or this obnoxious sound. People are monitoring it. Russians could be monitoring it all over the world. And if suddenly you can't hear that anymore, that could mean that something terrific or horrible has happened in then the Soviet Union, and they had the order to possibly, push the button and send the missiles to the United States. So, I mean, that's what it is. I mean, that's what people think that could be. And there's that station, and there was others that were very similar, and they thought that they were coming from, at that time during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. So it's very ominous. It's not something.
Oh yeah, I love it. I mean, I will sometimes find, so there's a really good web SDR that will pick it up really, really nicely at the evening time for where they're at. And you can hear it. And I've used it on my live stream before, and I'll just let it play. It's odd. I seem to like it a little bit. But, going back to what you were talking about earlier about, shortwave stations being used as propaganda, a lot of people are saying that these stations are still in effect because they are, in a way, their own form of propaganda. Anybody can listen to these stations. They don't know what they're there for, but one can infer all kinds of ideas. But at the very least, one could think, well, there's a spy still in our country. If they're transmitting and I'm picking it up in our country, then it's possible that there's a spy in here, and that message is for them. And so it's a very interesting kind of psychological warfare in a certain way. And the buzzer is a real good example of that, because, oh boy, we don't know what any of it means. It's not a message. And what happens if it stops, right?
Yeah, and it's, it's a message, but it could be a warning. It could be, and the other thing too is that something like that's going 24/7. I mean, basically that it sends a message like in the least that we're alert, or they're alert. And, it's the Russia or the Soviet Union or whatever never sleeps. And that thing is going night and day. It's one of the things too, like back in the Cold War and prior to that, these radio stations that were just enormous, sending out these huge signals. Also, it had to say something about technology then. Whereas, not so much now, but back then, technology and the ability to dominate the airwaves like that. And what about the fact that, some of these stations that were on 24/7, I mean, they took up a big chunk of radio back then, right? And I mean, was that on purpose, or just, I don't know. I mean,
so they'd be, I talked about how the number stations didn't really exist in the amateur radio spaces, at least they don't today.
Right.
There was a period, though, particularly in a high sun cycle, where the Russians would use something called the Russian woodpecker, which is like this low takeoff radar system. And they could at least that's the belief, they would basically jam out entire portions of radio frequency spaces, including portions of the amateur radio spaces. And so a lot of people are like, oh, this is Russia showing, flexing their muscle. Look what we can do. We can basically kill your radio,
exactly.
Your receive capability of your radio, which renders it useless, at least until they turn it off, right?
Here's another one. This is called, I think this one's called Swedish Rhapsody. So, you know.
Yeah, that's another one of those eerie ones. So that's like a kid's jewelry box. That freaks me out.
Right. Or the ice cream man, you know. The ice cream man is out there, but what's he bringing? You know, that one.
What's with all these ice cream men?
Right. And that one could have been interrupted at any time too by numbers or different things. And one of the things that really struck me was the fact that, and this goes back to what you said about people listening and monitoring these things, and they do. And you can read about one of these radio stations that basically did nothing but play whatever, and then they know, like on July 8th on this year, that it just broke for a second, or you could hear two people talking and they spoke these words. And that's amazing. And it's not just one or two people monitoring these things. I mean, you have people, you know, all over the US and the world who listen to them night and day.
And I mean, there's a lot of websites still active today that will post on number stations. You know, I heard it in this location on this frequency at this time of day, and they'll have a brief transcript of it. They're also the same group of people that will track pirate radio stations, because that's kind of a similar thing, right? Somebody has an unlicensed radio transmitter and not putting out a lot of power, but if it at the right time with the right antenna could get out there pretty decently. And they'll post updates like, oh, I heard, you know, radio blah blah blah, and it's always some kind of made up call thing. And they were transmitting such and such music, and they'll do a breakdown of how long it was on the air, how long they heard it, and what they heard. It's very, very cool.
So this is just a side note here, and I want to ask this question because you mentioned it, but what is a pirate radio station, and why are they bad?
So a pirate radio station is an unlicensed radio, that a radio transmitter. It's for like a frequency, a specific frequency. A lot of them you can change them, but they will come on the air kind of uncontrolled. They'll transmit usually songs that they technically aren't licensed to play. And they will just, you know, wherever they think they can get out, they'll hop on there. Why it's bad is, although this is a little bit rarer of a case, but why it's bad is they could technically be transmitting over the top of somebody that has already coordinated to use that frequency. And so that's a problem. Any radio could be a pirate radio if you use it to transmit out of a space that you're licensed to be on. Whether it's, you know, you're playing your favorite songs on some kind of FM frequency running an FM operation mode, or you're using a Baofeng, for instance, that you program to be not on the amateur radio frequencies, or it came to you programmed. You know, China doesn't really know much about our amateur radio service, but if it comes to you from China and the frequencies are off and you're using it to just talk to your buddy who has the same frequency.
So are there pirate...
then you could technically be... Go ahead.
I'm losing you a little bit. You're bouncing in and out, but I was going to ask you, are there pirate radio stations that pop up every day, same time, same place? And do they have a group of listeners?
So I don't know so much about every day. There may be there's websites. If you look up Pirate Radio Web Forum or Pirate Radio Forum or Number Stations Forum, you'll get one of them. You may have some websites already you can throw out there, but they will try and pinpoint when the station is active. There are some that will try and work in a similar frequency space. Usually they'll say, it's a couple of kilohertz up and down, a couple hundred kilohertz up and down this space. And that's where they normally transmit, but they don't necessarily do a set schedule, sometimes because they're trying to avoid getting in trouble, right?
Wow. So let me play this one. I don't remember what this one is, but they're all very interesting. Here's another clip.
Delta Foxtrot Delta 21 Delta Foxtrot Delta 21.
Now,
what's interesting?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say
what's
that's
about that one.
That's bizarre, but they're all bizarre.
Yeah, but that one's very interesting because you might have heard that sci-fi tone kind of behind
What
your
is
voice. That's a digital. That's digital audio.
Wow.
So if you had a receiver hooked up to a computer, you could technically copy that audio and decode another message.
Interesting.
It would give you another string of characters that then you could run through your one-time pad or whatever. But that audio sounded exactly like radio teletype, which is a mode of operation we use in amateur radio as well.
Interesting. All right, here's another. Wow.
Yeah, pretty freaky when you hear that come over the air.
And yeah, that's I couldn't even begin to. I think it would be an interesting career to be involved with that. What did you think it sounded like?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, you probably couldn't tell much of your family about what you do, right?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Maybe you're young in your military career, and then someone says, "Hey, you're kind of a loner type. I want you to just put together these radio broadcasts. We're going to send you a message, and you're going to encode it, and you're going to send it out." Because like I was saying, those voices of numbers, they all are just little recorded clips that they're stitching together most of the time. And so there's not somebody that's like, at least anymore that I know of, that is an actual human that is speaking the words live on the air. It's usually like some kind of pre-recorded little clips that they've stitched together. So yeah, you could be anybody. You just have a bank of all these numbers and you stitch them all together to make your message, and there you go.
Right. Let's listen to this one. That's a good one. Yodeling. I mean, yeah.
I like that. I mean, the key thing, because obviously the last two didn't have any numbers in it. So to remind everyone, they would play a song or something to kind of hold the frequency, if you will. And then the number station, the actual numbered message would break in at some point and be transmitted. So they'd always have, like, the Lincolnshire Poacher is a really good example, right? Because it has a very pronounced, like, you no question know what that audio is, and then it's followed up by the message, the ciphered text message. So if you were a spy again, and you'd have your radio, you'd have your earbuds on, because you wouldn't have this connected to a speaker, I assume. You'd have your earbuds in, you're listening, and you hear the message. Okay, I got to turn this up now, and I got to start writing. So it gives you enough time to say, I'm ready for the message, kind of thing.
And the interesting thing to me too is that the common denominator of all these stations, number stations, are the numbers. And excuse me, but they give out these string of numbers, and they're using the same type of encryption device, and it's used internationally. It's used all over the world, and it seems to be, real prevalent. And one of the things that I know, if I remember right, it was invented sort of by a guy named Frank Miller, and it was back in like 1917. So they're using this old technology and an encrypted one-time pad to decipher, these messages that are being broadcast by radio, and nobody's ever been able to break it. And a lot of these have remained covert, and a lot of countries weren't able to find where these stations were located, right? Yeah,
to go back a second on this one-time pad thing,
right?
These are So it's basically, right, I think we mentioned it a little bit. It's a string of numbers, right? That's the cipher or the deciphering keyword text. And you take the numbers and you would convert them. This is the numbers that you'd pick up over the air. You take the numbers that were received, write them down, and then you would convert them over into letters using these one-time pads. And then after you had that message complete, you'd rip the pad off and throw it away. And you know, sometimes these pads were made out of highly flammable materials, very spy-like, so you could burn them up. There's stories of, you know, actually transferring these little pads, super microscopic text that you'd have to use high-powered like magnifying glasses to pull the numbers out, and they'd use, you know, really non-questioning items to transfer these pads into the country, right? Because once you run out of your pad, you're not going to be able to code any more messages until you get a new pad. And so they would literally have to funnel in these physical devices to be able to make this all work. So it's pretty interesting, the lengths that they would go to kind of smuggle in these little pads. And so you had immigration officers and people at the border like looking through people's properties to find these type of pieces of paper, rolled up scrolls. I saw one that was actually they used a walnut to smuggle in a one-time pad. That's very interesting, the type of concealments they'd use to get them in.
Yeah. I was in the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and they actually have a one-time pad that's on microfilm, and that little chunk of microfilm was hidden inside of a hollow nickel. So like if you had a handful of change, you know, you'd have this nickel that had this one-time pad hidden inside. But one of the things, too, that's interesting that, you know, it seems foolproof, but there were some drawbacks, and one of them was that they were having a problem, and especially back in, you know, in the Cold War days, and drawing or finding getting a true random number generation, which seems to me like that wouldn't be a problem at all. But in order to be entirely covert and unable to break this, they had to have a true random number generator that didn't really exist back then.
Mm-hmm. I don't know enough about this, but I think what that's referring to is, you know, if you had listened to these transmissions all the time of these encoded messages, and we know, you know, countries were probably had listening stations just for these number stations. If you listen to enough of those messages and you truly didn't have a random number, you had a pseudo-random number. If your sample was large enough of these encrypted messages, over time, you might be able to determine some numbers are going to come up more often than not, and then you might be able to kind of break down some of the characters from that when that number appears. And that's, you know, that's a very interesting thing as well, because, yeah, like you said, that didn't really exist back then.
Well, and you also had multiple number stations that you could have linked those two together. You could have number station coming from two parts of the world, but when they're using these random numbers and they had a pseudo random number, they could be possibly linked. Yeah, that's a Soviet, even though that's coming out of you know, wherever, that's still a Soviet number station. So that's just it's just hugely interesting, and it's so deep, you know, and it's interesting on so many different levels that it's mind blowing. Let me play this one, and I don't remember what this one is, but I'm sure you'll recognize it. I think that's part of the. Let me try this one right here. This is a different one.
She, Bosom, she, the boss, bedroom, Bosom, she, the boss, bedroom, the boss, you enough.
That one's particularly creepy to me because that person really sounds worried, and that's reading those numbers, and It's crazy.
Yeah, it's got a real inhuman tone to it.
Yeah,
There's the ones that are
inhuman's
just
correct.
the tones, the oscillating tones freak me out more than any of them, I
Right.
think.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So, I guess, I think it's really important to realize that, this is still happening. That we still use these, or somebody on this planet still uses these, and seemingly it's technology that we would think of as outdated, especially with computers and everything, but it's really not. And it's one of those things that probably will be around for a while, and shortwave radio, ham radio, it's going to be around forever. What are some practical applications in your world do people use it for? Particularly, I'm speaking of natural disasters and events like that.
Oh, man, that's a very apropos question. Tomorrow, my live stream is on bugging in and what you would need in your home to be prepared for like a disaster with radio. We use them for a lot of things. Going back to the handy talkies, give everybody a handy talkie. And they don't have to be an amateur radio handy talkie. They can be those FRS blister pack Walmart type radios. But with those radios, they're very underpowered. As amateurs, we get access to higher powered radios. So I have the ability to, relay local communication. So say the internet, the phones, the power's out. I've got my radio station runs off of solar and batteries. Because again, we got to be self-reliant. I can communicate with others, and there are civil emergency response teams or community emergency response teams that will use similar frequencies to run traffic back and forth. And so we could say pretty quickly, hey, I've got somebody in cardiac arrest, or the power is out, they have an oxygen machine, I need to get a generator here. That's a real practical application. But it goes more than that, right? There are different emergency preparedness teams called ARES and RECES, and they will go so far as to use email systems over RF. And so we can transmit a pretty decent amount of information over RF using our radios. And that's helpful for like incident reports to kind of define what's going on the ground level, or to say, hey, I have a patient, so-and-so, we are going to move them from this location to another location to a hospital that's under generator power, stuff like that. And when I'm out in the field with my radio is GPS enabled, so I can get my lat long information really easily. And my radio will transmit packet data. So just like you would use over the Ethernet in your home, packet data. That packet data is picked up by other radios, and it's propagated around. And it goes so far as to get populated eventually on a map. And you can go on a website, and my wife can pull that up and go, oh, there's Josh. He's walking up the mountain right now. But it all starts with radio. We're able to transfer that data where cell phones won't work, all via ham radio.
Technology really started with radio, and it's just exploded. But I want everybody to know that my guest tonight has been ham radio expert and educator Josh of Ham Radio Crash Course. Josh, before we go, just dig in a little to your YouTube channel and mention again what you'll find there.
Yeah. So on the Ham Radio Crash Course YouTube channel, I do a live stream on Saturdays, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and I post reviews and deep dives, smaller form videos, about 10 to 15 minutes. And I try and keep it amateur radio related. I try and keep it fun and interesting. The YouTube channel has more of a bend towards younger generations. And from the kind of the interest that people have shown, we've created a Facebook group, and we have a Discord, which is like a new version of IRC chat rooms from back in the day. And our goal with the Ham Radio Crash Course and all the people involved in it is to create an inclusive environment where, your questions are valued as any other question. And we try and help people kind of get started with ham radio via our videos on how to get training to take the test and get licensed. And then, once you have your radio, what fun stuff can you do with it? So I'm always exploring new and interesting things in amateur radio and getting information out there where I can to hopefully get people motivated and stay motivated within the hobby.
So please go to YouTube and check out Josh, Ham Radio Crash Course. Well worth it. Been a great night for radio and a great night for podcasting. And Josh, I want to thank you for joining me so much. Very generous of you, because I know you're a busy guy. I'm blown away by all the videos And thank you so much, sir.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. I love talking about ham radio and number stations. I don't do enough of that at the same time, so thank you.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.